I have this expectation of the good that church is going to provide for me. But then
Right.
once I get there and I get involved, if it is a church where spiritual abuse is happening, the opposite happens. My
Right.
expectations are shattered. And instead of trustworthy friendships, I now have worse friendships. And I feel like the ones in the world were better. Instead of getting healed, I feel like worse off than before. And some of this is tied to a spiritual leader, a pastor who has selfish ambitions and is trying to build his kingdom under the name of God's kingdom and is just using people to fulfill that purpose.
In this episode, I dive deep with my friend Aaron Daigle on the topic of church hurt. This is an entire 45-minute discussion as we go into Aaron's story, how he overcame it, and ultimately what his life looks like on the other side of it. If you're looking for something specific, I've included chapters down in the description below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy this conversation. So Aaron, how are you today, man?
I'm good, man. Good to see you, bro. What's happening with you?
Yeah, man, just hanging out, doing the coffee thing in the middle of the day, and as is the trend for my life. So
Absolutely. I'm H2O in it, brother.
man, I need to drink more water. I think one of these days I'm gonna get one of those apps and actually stick to it. You know what I'm saying? So Aaron, why don't you introduce yourself just real quick, man? Just do a quick intro, give our audience some context on who you are, and maybe we can talk a little bit how we randomly connected. I think we just became internet friends, right? And
Totally.
and stay connected.
Yeah, I grew up around the things of God, man, and then got into the street life, got involved in drugs real heavy, particularly when a horrible incident happened. My mom was raped in front of me, and I was just pretty much done with God. So I left church, went to the streets. I got back in around 17 and quickly was like all in, man. I'm going for it. I was like, get saved, get baptized, only live for Jesus, go to ministry. I dove in and got back into the things of God. Did church work for a long time while going to college, teaching in high school, pastoral ministry, youth pastor in small groups, pastoring, became the congregation pastor of a Spanish church. And then I went through a horrible transition, just some deep church hurt, some abuse, some things my wife and I walked through with our lead pastor at the time. And it transitioned us into what I knew I would always be doing, which was traveling and speaking. But that opened up the opportunity no longer being in that local church to start working on some books, YouTube videos, getting online, podcasting, things like that. And so we're in that sphere together. We do work with couples as well. My wife's a marriage and family therapist. So I help a little bit with that. But that's a bulk of marriage is her deal. And then the YouTube videos and books and stuff is where I'm at and traveling, speaking in the churches.
Awesome, man. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I think we connected, right, because of some of our similar passion, right, to see people in recovery, see people with addictions get their lives together, man. And it's awesome to see that connection's been on, stayed active over the last couple of years. So YouTube, right? I've been following you and watching your reels, man. You're throwing reels up all the time. You're up there all the time, which is awesome, man. They're encouraging and uplifting. And I found my way over to your YouTube channel where you recently published a series on church hurt. And, I think it seems to be a buzzword, right? There's a lot of conversation about church hurt, maybe not enough, but we see some of these big incidents, right? Hillsong's been in the news lately. We see,
Right.
I grew up in the day of remembering the whole Praise the Lord scandal. And, my mind thinks about all of that and thinks about all the people that are impacted, by these major events. What kind of led you to start talking about church hurt? I know you shared a little bit in your intro about a rough transition. What led you to start doing those YouTube videos and having that conversation?
Man, I went through about 5 years, the tail end of being in church. I had a lead pastor, and then I was the sort of the administrative pastor running small groups, the Spanish church, prayer, everything under his ministry in our local church. And we had a great relationship. He was a father figure to me. He was everything. I mean, I went to him with all questions and I adored him, The last 5 years of that, though, things took a turn for the worse. He had got in his head that my wife and I were not being loyal, that we were out, to sabotage his church or his ministry. But I don't know exactly, but it took a very nasty turn. I share a lot of the details on the YouTube videos. not as much as I think I'm going to share in the book ultimately that I put out on it. Man, to be honest, dude, I sat on it for years. I have been 6.5 years out of that church, and I was scared, bro. I was scared to talk about it, scared to talk about, the fact that I was hurt in church, because I felt like, man, doors are going to close. Pastors aren't going to invite us. Podcasters aren't going to want us on their show. Because like in the Christian world, you don't talk about the fact that you were hurt in church. So finally, I just felt led. I got some encouragement for some friends, and I shared more of the details on the videos, and just been taking wherever the Lord leads us from there, ever since, bro.
What was the paradigm for you that caused you to kind of go from this point of you've been silent about it? I don't want to say much. It could cost me a reputation or open doors or whatever, to being able to finally get to that place where you're like, you know what? I've got to speak about this now.
Hearing how many people are going through it. When it all blew up, I sat in my house for 6 weeks. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't have no church, no pastor. I was depressed. I'm not naturally prone to depression. And I had no direction. Like the whole world that I knew was ripped out from under me. And I felt very alone, but then there's no resources. Like, where do you go? Who do you go talk to? And I would look for help. And the only thing I found, which was a very solid resource, was The Bait of Satan. But that was sort of that's written in the context of whenever like your heart like needs to be right with God, and you like it gave me something, but it wasn't everything that I needed. And I started talking with other people traveling, and I'm hearing, I went through this, or I'm not in church anymore. I hate God because of this experience. And I said, wow, like I'm not the only one. There's other people dealing with this, and it needs to be talked about.
Hey, real quick, interrupting the conversation just for a moment, that if you found any value out of this conversation so far, please hit the like button below.
And that Bait of Satan book is fantastic, but you're right. I mean, it's about dealing with the personal offense, but and really checking our motives, right? But sometimes when we are correct, and there is that hurt, and those leaders have impacted us, it's like, man, how do I process that? And yeah, there's so many people, man. I think about the struggles of modern church and how I'm not hopeless, but it seems like we're losing ground, right? Especially in America, it seems like we're going backwards. And I wonder how many folks out there are struggling with church, and the reason the church is kind of feeling like it's going backwards, even though we are getting closer to eternity. How many people are out there and they've had these unspoken issues and they've just abandoned the church as a result? How would you define church hurt? So say somebody's listening to this and they're like, I think I've had some experiences, but like when you say church hurt, Aaron, what do you mean by that?
To answer that, and let's continue exactly what you're saying, is this, society is sort of winning and getting ahead to where like this Christian nation, America, the place where God, if he has a place on earth to live, it's America,
It's here. Yeah.
It's changed. Society has been so disillusioned and, from a lot of misconceptions and faulty beliefs, but this hatred from the church that was always in society that has now exploded. Well, now what we're seeing is a lot of people who were once in church following in those same trends now. And so like, there's also these massive groups of people with Christian backgrounds who are saying, man, I hate the church. I'm done with the church. And they're disillusioned with what they've seen. And most of what they have seen has been church hurt, what we're talking about. So with that, talking about what it is, when we go to church, unless we're drugged to church as kids or because we're trying to please a spouse, for the most part as an adult, we're going to go with an expectation. I want to be healed of something. I want friends I can trust in. I have this expectation of the good that church is going to provide for me. But then once I get there and I get involved, if it is a church where spiritual abuse is happening, the opposite happens. My expectations are shattered. And instead of trustworthy friendships, I now have worse friendships. And I feel like the ones in the world were better. Instead of getting healed, I feel like worse off than before. And some of this is tied to a spiritual leader, a pastor who has selfish ambitions and is trying to build his kingdom under the name of God's kingdom and is just using people to fulfill that purpose. And when people feel used like that, and that they're not being lifted into the fulfilling of their calling and their ministry, but they're being used to fulfill somebody's selfish ambition because a mega church is going to give him a name. Now he can be the next Stephen Furtick because he's got this big mega church. And then people feel that, and it crushes people. You're bulldozing over people to accomplish this kingdom that is said to be God's kingdom, but it's not. And these words and actions are just leaving Christians disillusioned. And so hence the term church hurt.
Yeah, I was listening to Ruslan. I don't know if you follow Ruslan on YouTube at all, but he's got some amazing content. But he was having a conversation about the amount of pastors that have this communication gift, right? And in the right context, they can use it. But what's happened is, for those of us who have a heart for ministry, the church has typically been the only alternative. And so outside of modern culture, you've got a bunch of people that have an incredible communication gift, have a bunch of charisma, but ultimately are in a shepherding role, leading churches, and they really shouldn't be, right? And so it's not good for the leader, and it's not good for the church members either, because there's nothing wrong with, building the platform. But when you try to do that in the wrong context, we start to see some of the fallout as a result of that. And so you said church hurt, man. I love that expectation and offense, right? And John Bevere does talk about that in his book. I think one of the quotes in there was, the greater the expectation, the greater the offense. But let's bring that back a little bit, right? Because there should be some expectations when we come to church. Like, it should be a safe place. And I believe that. Like, I think church should be the safest place on the earth to struggle. Said that so many times before. And so how do we deal with that, right? Coming in and we're walking into a church and we feel it. Like, what are some of the signs, church hurt? I know you did a video that describes I think 9 of them. 9 signs of church hurt, and 9 signs that it may be happening.
Justin, I agree with that too. Like, it should be, and it is the best place to struggle. It is a healthy place. It's that just because you get pricked by a needle doesn't mean the whole haystack is full of spikes. And so it's that one, it's like you get into that one church that just warps your idea about it. But anyways, of the 9 signs, let's kind of talk about 2, 3 of them, kind of dance around here. But one of the big ones I've seen is separating you from friends and family, both before and after. So, I think the church is a huge component to our world. But if you're only working in church, your only focus is in church, like, God never called you to just be inside of a bubble. He called you to be infiltrating the world and to changing the world, not being like the world, but being that influence, to be that light shining on a hill. And so anything that takes you away from everything to the exclusion of that alone is sort of cultish. I mean, it is cultish.
So what does that look like? How does that play out? Like, when you say separating from friends and family, you don't have to share any personal or specific, but like, how would you describe that? What does that look like for somebody who might wonder?
An extreme example, in our case, when we left the church, we had to tell everyone that it was our fault that we left, because we hurt our pastors, and we had to sell our house. We had to move out of our city. Anybody who texted us or emailed us or called us, we were not allowed to respond to them. So it was an extreme case of you are not allowed to talk to anybody in this church ever again.
Wow.
Under threats of if you do, I'm going to go after your ministerial license,
Wow.
And then on the back end was telling the people in his church, or Aaron and Ceci, that's my wife, they were not loyal. They were, we later found out that he had accused us of stealing money from the church. It was just crazy stuff. But those rifts that were completely separating these friendships that we had developed for 10 years as pastors in that church. So that's more of an extreme case. But, anything that if 90% of your waking hours is you have to be here, you cannot, do any other activities, you cannot be involved in any other groups, then that's weird and cultish.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a meme on Facebook not so long ago, and it said, if we don't go to the same church anymore, we can still talk to each other. This is church. We're not in gangs. It's like,
yes.
And that's the mindset behind it, right? And so the separation from the friends and family. So you mentioned just a few seconds ago, it was as much as the conversation was don't even text him anymore. And it was the encouragement was So basically, once you're gone from the church, they're black sheep, right? It's like we don't associate anymore. And so I would reference that back to, again, what you said at the beginning, this mindset of the leader building his own kingdom, right, instead of the greater kingdom. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely, Justin.
Yeah. Yeah. So what about any other signs that you've seen that might be helpful?
Yeah, talking to you in confidence about the other people in the church, especially if you're like, okay, the pastor bringing you into the confidence and saying, yeah, I'm really concerned about so and so. If someone's talking to you about other people, then I guarantee you, when the scenario changes, they'll be talking to other people about you.
Right.
And that, what I found in that scenario and those experiences was that it was pitting everyone against each other. And the one source was the spiritual leader at the top. Just
Wow.
Gossip.
Yeah.
Really, yeah. It's crazy to even verbalize it. I'm hesitating as I'm saying it because I'm like, this sounds crazy.
It's that whole mindset. It's like, this is just between me and you, right?
Yeah,
but when you've had that conversation with 6 people, is that really the truth anymore? Yeah. And I almost feel like some leaders do that at times. It's like, if the leader can set the tone right across all these conversations, then if something blows up, it's like, well, I told you so. I told you this was happening.
Wow.
And it's almost like they're they're building this web, if you will, to almost shield themselves from any maybe accountability or responsibility. Tom Cruise, I think, not Tom Cruise, it was Tom Hanks, and that movie We Were Soldiers. Is it We Were Soldiers that he was in? No, Saving Private Ryan. But he made the comment, one of his soldiers asked him, he said, well, why don't you ever complain to me? And he said, well, gripes go up, they don't go down, right? And it's that mindset in leadership that if we're complaining to the people that we should be complaining about or complaining to, the people that we're supposed to be leading, there's something off in that dynamic, in that relationship, right? It basically just becomes gossip. Not everything. I think that's the struggle sometimes in church. My opinion is that we use the term venting, or we're having private ministry discussions as an excuse to just break the biblical command not to gossip. We mask them very well, give ourselves excuses and permission to do so.
Absolutely, bro. That's coined it all in the perfect phrase right there, bro.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. So give me one more sign of abuse. You're talking about spiritual leaders, toxic leaders. How do they set up these systems to cover their own narcissism, right? Because a toxic leader, and maybe that's a whole mouthful right there. Maybe we can jump into that a little bit in this abuse area.
So as far as covering it up, one thing I've seen is a smokescreen of accountability. It's like, hey, I'm the pastor. You have to submit, spiritual leadership, be loyal to the church. But then who's holding that pastor accountable? Who is that pastor's pastor? And if you ask, they may have an answer, and it's going to be like some guy who lives 9 states away, or it's a group of pastors who are the board of the church, but they're all, the only thing they know about the church is what that lead pastor is telling them about the church. So there's no way to hold him accountable. And I get it. Like, the people we're leading should not be, holding us accountable. But like, if you have I think at some point, like, that's kind of a warped mindset. Like, you should have somebody around you who's close enough, who can pull your coattail, as they say, and say, bro, you're wrong, man. You're not doing this right. You need to check your motives. Like, somebody needs to be able to confront you. And when you remove all that, and then here's another part of it, is put people in positions who are yes men, who are obedient, and then constantly remove people who are voicing concerns. Well, then you insulate yourself with this leadership team of yes men. And then people in the church, they might not go to you. They might go to that person on that team, but really they're getting the same advice from that one person because he's running the whole information input into that one team. So it's just a couple ideas as far as insulating, and how it's covered up.
Being somebody that's in ministry, I connect with people all the time, right? And so I imagine a lot of people that have dealt with some of this stuff, dealt with some of this church hurt like you did, have you stayed quiet about it for a while, right? And so if they did make their way back to the church for one reason or another, I would imagine that individual that's been impacted by this church hurt has insulated themselves. Like, I'm not going to get hurt again. How do we recognize that? I mean, how do we minister to somebody who has been in this type of situation, that's had a toxic leader and felt hurt by the church?
That is a great question, Justin. There's a lot of caveats to that, and when we get hurt, it is very difficult to plug back in, like from the perspective of the person who is hurt. It's also we become very prone to being critical of the church and of the new pastor. We've seen the junk, we've been damaged, so we go and we reconnect. What you're going to experience is an inhibition to connect to that new church, to that new pastor. You're going to be very leery and possibly quite critical, just like seeing all the negatives because you're sore. You don't want to get burned again, and so you're just on this hypervigilance. Pastors, on the other hand, now you're asking as a minister, how do we recognize that? We are going to see those lack of ability to fully commit. Just maybe not fully given their heart and are checking things out for an extended period of time. We may not know why unless the person has been vulnerable and opened that up to us, but chances are they're not. I've actually tried to connect hurt people from church hurt to new churches. And in the meetings, have heard the people flat out tell the pastors, like, I will never trust what a pastor ever tells me again. So extensive hurt like that. The pastor then has to assume the responsibility. Am I willing to love these people through this? And that is going to be hard. It is going to be hard to be criticized as a leader, to constantly be questioned, and to love people past their hurt. And not every leader is going to be equipped for that. Thankfully, what I have seen is that churches whose pastors have been hurt and then healed tend to attract hurt people, and God uses them to heal them. Most often, God is definitely aware of the leader's giftings and will send the right people to that church for healing. It is challenging on both ends. I cannot overlook that. For a hurt person to give a new pastor a chance is a leap of faith for that person. And for a pastor to love a person past that hurt it takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy and a lot of willingness just to be like Christ and say, I'm going to take a lot of, hurt and rejection and criticism and just show this person through consistent action that love is real, that Christ likeness is real, and that genuine leadership in the church exists.
Yeah, that's really good. So Aaron, your story, how did you guys start that path to healing? Like, what was it for you that got you to this place where, you recognize what had been done with you? You're out of the ministry at that point, if I understand your story correctly. How did you guys start to pick the pieces back up and heal some of those scars?
Yeah. So when we left, like I said, I was 6 weeks just in the house, sitting in a chair in the dark room. I was low. And my father-in-law, who's a pastor, kept telling me, he says, you need to go to your presbyter, who would be like a bishop in the Catholic Church, just sort of a leader over a section of pastors. And he says, you need to go tell him what happened. And I was resistant. I said, I'm not going, because then I have to explain what happened to with my former pastor. I'm not going to shed him in any negative light. And he was very insistent. And I just refused to do it. And out of sheer desperation, I went to a professional therapist and to the presbyter. So I went to both men the same week. And I had an outline of basically the whole story in like a 30-minute recap to give them context, and just said, like, what do I do? What's going on? The therapist helped tremendously because he pointed out basically all the gaslighting that had been happening, because I was internalizing this. It's like, is it my fault? What did I do wrong? Did I touch the Lord's anointed? Did I offend God? And all that internal stuff, and the things my pastor told me that I would not succeed without him. The direct sabotage. I'll tell you the story if we have time here in a minute. But so the therapist says, Aaron, like, you were in an abusive relationship, and like seeing that, like acknowledging that, when I started to see, this was a narcissist. This is a sociopath that you were in a relationship with. Now the results of that is what I'm dealing with. Like, the light brought healing. The flip side was talking with the presbyter, and he called my former pastor, and then it went above my presbyter's head all the way to the superintendent, which is over the whole state. And basically, after it was all said and done and investigated, I was found to be in right standing with the organization. And the presbyter told the other pastor, he says, man, leave him alone. But I had committed to my pastor. When we had left, he says, sell your house, move out of the city. You cannot go to a church in any of the 3 parishes, which are counties in Louisiana. You have to say the issue. They gave us this list of things, and I agreed to them. So the presbyter who became my pastor, who's now currently my pastor, he told me, he says, man, you gave your word and now you're bound by that and you feel this condemnation. He says, you need to call your former pastor and tell him very kindly but respectfully, you're not going to do that you are going to honor him, but that's it. And so I called him on the phone and he answered, and I just told him, I said, look, I need to apologize. I gave you my word that I would, not tell people what really happened, that I would sell my house, that I would not go to a church. And I was like, I can't do that. I'm going to live my life freely, and wherever God leads me, I'm going to go, but I'm not going to bash you. And that really broke some things off of us. And then we got into a church, a year and a half we were there, and then doors started open. We started traveling and preaching. That was always my calling. I always knew I would travel and speak, sort of like what they call an evangelist in some circles.
Right.
Doors open there, and then the Lord had directed me, quit your job, start writing books, start doing videos. And it just picked up, and gradually getting involved again, reconnecting with healthy churches, healthy pastors. And over time, we found a sense of healing to where we can now talk about it without the hurt, without the pain, without the anger, and we're finding our footing again.
Amen. Yeah, you used the word gaslighting, right? And I think wasn't that Webster's most popular word in 2022? I think it was. It was one of the ones at the top of the list. But I think people have a good understanding of what gaslighting is. I mean, it's a term that is very prevalent in culture, but can you explain gaslighting specifically in the context of church?
We had Saturday mornings. My wife and I would meet for our marriage. We would talk, read a book, a marriage book, his needs, her needs, have some coffee. Well, my pastor instituted Saturday morning prayer. And we would go, but we started feeling like, man, this is our date time. This is our once a week. We both were working full-time jobs. Plus we were both working in the church, And so I was like, man, I can't do this, Pastor. I'm sorry. I'm not going to be able to go. That became a big fiasco. But when we were discussing it, it was never like acknowledging or seeing that, hey, my marriage is important. I'm dedicating 30 other hours. It was simply put back on us. Well, you don't have a heart for this house. You're not being loyal to this house where God called you. And then we were also punished for that. We were told we were not allowed to travel and speak out in other churches. Anytime a pastor invited us to speak, we had to tell them that we were busy in our local church. And
so is your district, you have to have the approval of your sending pastor, I would assume, to go out and speak? Is that kind of how they had that control, if you will?
Yes. It's sort of an unsaid thing within that church. However, thankfully, about 50% of what we do in ministry is inside of that organization. We also, we're spread a lot wider than just that organization. But it was a personal thing. There was no leverage as far as I had to do it. It was simply I felt like honoring my pastor was honoring God. So organization aside, whether it was in the organization or pastors outside of the organization, I always told them no, because that's what my pastor had told me to do. Yeah. Even though it was punitive, that was irrelevant.
I think that's good context though for those who are listening, to see your heart in the matter, right? It's here I am. I'm just trying to honor the man of God in front of me, and yet it's constantly taken advantage of. Or we see these gaslighting techniques that were being used against you, and it's on. So what would you say if let's just say there's somebody listening to this and they're seeing some of this in their church? The advice, man, do they run? Do they try to confront it? How they're not at the point where they've been hurt yet, right? It hasn't gotten that bad. It hasn't mushroomed up, but they're recognizing some of these signs and I feel like I could be entering into this, and I kind of see it on the horizon. How do they deal with that?
In that particular context, I would simply advise to just go somewhere where it's healthy.
Okay.
Unless you feel like God has put you there to address it. Gotcha. But that's going to be far and few between. I think that's going to be for ministry, lay ministers, maybe youth pastors, assistant pastors, guys like that who are in ministry and are seeing the problems, and you've already committed to that church, and now you're seeing these red flags. then at that case, like you might be there to influence it, and just up and packing and leaving right away might not be good. If you're just visiting a church and you're in the crowd and you're like looking around on a Sunday morning and you see like, 7 out of the 9 signs that I talk about in the video glaring at you in the face, I'd be like, you know what, I'm gonna go to a different church next Sunday.
Right. So it's the music.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for the lay minister, they've got to be able to, the youth pastor, if I'm on staff or I'm serving in a church in a leadership role, then my response is really, I need to seek God and make sure that I've been brought here to influence this change, right? Before I start going down that battle. But if I'm a member or I'm just, I'm hitting the church up on Sunday, maybe volunteering every once in a while, it's a battle you would advise against somebody fighting.
Yeah, Justin, it's the Bible says, engaging in a quarrel that's not your own is like a passerby who grabs a dog by the ears, and there's a whole nother caveat to spiritual abuse, which is the spirit of Jezebel. And I know that a lot of people have a very limited experience with Jezebel. They think it's just a promiscuous woman, which is a very narrow-minded view. Jezebel is not attached to a man or a woman. It is a spirit of control and manipulation that comes into somebody's heart whenever they have been abused and have not fully healed from that abuse, be it sexual, physical, whatever. And that spirit seeks the highest position in politics, in church, in business, because it wants to control and transfer hurt and offense. So a lot of times when we have spiritual abuse happening in a church, what is happening is that lead pastor or whoever is in that position that is hurting people is tied to a spirit of Jezebel. That being said, the spirit of Jezebel is highly confrontational, very intimidating, very demeaning. And so anytime you try to address it, even if it's in the right spirit, even though you have legitimate facts, most likely you're going to get your head chopped off in the, figuratively speaking, in the situation. And so if God has called you there, if he's put a Jehu anointing on you to confront this, I don't want to tell nobody, not to move forward and charge into the battle. The Bible says if your brother has aught against you, go to him. And it says, if you have something against your brother, go to him. So either way, whoever's at fault, it doesn't matter. It tells you to confront the person privately and then to go and bring other people. But again, it also tells you in other contexts, don't just go engage in a battle unless the Lord's sending you into it. So chances are it's not going to be your fight. You probably need to just leave because it's just going to get worse and blow up in your face and you can be gaslighted. And then the longer you entangle with that, the more confusion and disillusionment will result. But if you want to take that approach, somebody needs to deal with it. So.
Right. But when we sit under it, though, those of us in the faith, I don't think we could ever imagine. I used to share this with addicts, people that were struggling with addiction all the time. Nobody woke up one day and said, I'm just going to become an addict overnight. There was this progression of things that happened. And I think sometimes, in the context of church hurt, we could sit under this and continue to be chipped away at for years.
Wow.
And then the mindset behind that is as we're being chipped away, then we end up in a position, well, I'm just done with the church. But nobody that's serving God, faithfully thinks that they're going to be in a position where they eventually could be hurt and abused so much that they just walk away from their faith entirely. And so I think it's good advice, that you just gave. Not my battle to fight. Like there may be a scenario and a hill that the Lord calls me to die on. But when it comes to the value of church relationship and church family, and, I need to be in a healthy place because I'm called to serve that church. But then also that place is called to help my family grow and mature. And if I'm constantly fighting these battles and being chipped away at, then, that's certainly not healthy for the individual that's in it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd say 99.9% of people that applies to. Like there was one Jehu in scripture who God used for Jezebel. Like that's it, So
yeah, I grew up Pentecostal, man. They threw the Jezebel term around everywhere. Anybody they disagreed with, the Jezebel spirit.
Oh yeah. And that's sad because it takes away from the reality of what that spirit is. And but that's another.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
So Aaron, you're back. You're engaged in the ministry again, man. The Lord's using you to travel and share stuff on the internet. And I know you did a video on 3 ways to serve God after, and I'm going to link this whole series for Aaron down in the description. But what did that look like? The journey back, right? What would you? Let's say there's somebody listening that's recovering from church hurt, and now it's like, okay, I think I'm ready to be vulnerable again. and I'm ready to engage in the ministry. What did that look like for you, and what might that look like for somebody else?
Bro, the revelation of like, okay, it's okay to talk about this and to call it for what it actually is was the number one step, because I was
Yeah.
so afraid to say it. Like, I felt like if I talk about church hurt, I'm the problem. If I
Mm,
say that my pastor abused me, then it's me who was the one who caused all this. And
right.
so you have to reveal in order to heal. Like, what did I
Mm,
go through? You have to acknowledge this. And that's key. I know it's so simple, but like in my case, man, I sat for too long not naming it. Once you're ready, like you asked, take that. How do you take that step? You sort of got to challenge yourself. You have to give yourself time. You just can't give yourself forever. I actually was sitting at the table and had some people who were hurt in church, and there was another minister at the table. The person says to the hurt person, "You just get involved. I don't understand. Like, just
right.
jump in, And I thought to myself, that's like telling someone with a broken leg,
Mm,
oh, just start jogging again. If you jog, like the leg will be okay. That's true, but it's not true right now. But the
right.
person cannot sit and heal with their leg propped up for the rest of their life. Like,
Yeah.
there's a timing to it, but at some point you have to reset that bone. You have to get back up on it and do some physical therapy, and it's not going to be comfortable. What happened to us is not our fault, but healing from it is our responsibility.
That's good.
So
Yeah.
taking that leap of saying, I am going to trust again. I am going to, connect with another church. I am going to re-engage. Those are some very basic, like simple, but not easy steps to
Right.
take, yet necessary.
Yeah, and it's okay for the person, right, to put some boundaries in place, right, to protect
Absolutely.
themselves. Like sometimes, like I'm just gonna dive all in. I don't know how to swim, but I'm in the pool and I ain't got no life vest on. In the eight
Yeah,
foot,
that's
and my
foolish.
my kids do that all the time. They want to run and jump in the 8 foot section of the pool, especially the younger ones. And it's like, hold on, hold up a little bit. I don't want to have to jump in and save you, and you can't swim. And so it's okay for them to put that life vest on, have a little bit of boundaries. Do you have any insight into that? What type of boundaries, that type of person would put in place?
Uh,
Not
so
that type of person. Sorry, that was the wrong term to use. Somebody who's been hurt by church. That sounded
yeah,
terrible. Yeah.
boundaries are healthy, and
Yeah.
any healthy person will have boundaries. Jesus had boundaries. It's kind and it's Christ-like to be kind to people and to answer their questions and things like that. But Jesus would say, like, they're trying to trip him up, and he's like, and they say, well, tell me, how you do this or what, and he says, I'll tell you what, you tell me, blah blah blah, and they're like, oh, we don't know. He's like, well, I ain't telling you either. Like, I'm
Right.
not going to
Yeah.
play those games. I'm not going to allow
Yeah.
you to corner me. I'm not, and that's a very small example, but Paul also was, very, very firm in his identity and would not let people just say anything about him without, him speaking up.
Yeah.
Um, I did read Safe People and I read Boundaries, both by the same author, Cloud and
Mhm.
Townsend, and I
I haven't
highly
read Save People
recommend
yet.
them.
Yeah.
Oh man, Safe People is fantastic, and specifically even more so than Boundaries for people who are dealing with church hurt, because it shows you how to deal with a narcissist or a sociopath or somebody particularly who is very unsafe, which would
Yeah.
definitely fit the qualifications. But the biggest thing we can talk about here with boundaries, I'll say, is to just like understand that having boundaries is good. It's Christ-like. It's healthy.
Yeah.
That is the biggest misconception. It's like, if I set up boundaries like that, I'm being mean or I'm being unchristian. That is the furthest thing from the truth.
Yeah.
Boundaries are absolutely essential. The reason we got hurt in the first place is because we did not have healthy boundaries in place.
Mm,
Like, as far as our responsibility, again, it's not our fault. I'm not,
right.
but however, as far as our responsibility, had we had healthy boundaries in place, we would have been protected, right? And
Yeah.
so, a caveat to what you go through in church hurt is to learn that, okay, I need to put up boundaries.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
yeah,
I imagine that's got to be so hard, man. Like when you're looking at a leader, and we use these terms, narcissist and sociopath, and like out of the people that are supposed to be our shepherds, like, and that I can't even imagine. That's a hard dichotomy, like, to swallow, that When I see the way, I mean, Jesus was direct, but man, he loved, and when I think of Jesus as the shepherd, and the pastor is supposed to be that shepherd for me, not my Jesus, but my shepherd, right? And then I get entangled with this person who's narcissistic and has all these tendencies. I mean, that's just really got to wreck the brain and the heart a little bit, to have that, relationship be so perverted, if you will, from what it's supposed to be.
Absolutely, bro. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's devastating, man.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm grateful for you speaking up and talking about it. I think that, as I brought out in the intro, a lot of times we think church hurt and we go to this extreme and we think about some of these huge, scandals that have happened in the church publicly and all the people that have been hurt by those things. But really, Aaron, what I'm getting from you is that this church hurt thing is something that happens at a much more micro level across the country. It's not always these huge scandals, but it's kind of this day-to-day kind of entanglement with spiritually abusive leaders. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think it says where selfish ambition exists, every evil. Yep. In James 3:16, it says, where there's selfish ambition, you will find every kind of evil. Right. And so going back to what we expect that a shepherd, that a pastor would be loving and selfless and helpful and like shepherding people. But when there's selfish ambition, like it's somebody who is leading a church that has not dealt with that soulish arena in their lives, that is like in it for my name. Like the Bible says, every kind of evil exists. So manipulation, control, fear, confusion, perversion, like all of these things are there. That's a guarantee from the word, right? And so, the big things are going to catch the media attention, but unfortunately, there's no, like, you don't have to literally appear before God and say, God, okay, I feel called to pastor a church. Should I pastor a church? And he give you a stamp of approval. Like, it's the beauty of being in a Christian nation is that any Joe Blow on any street corner can start a church.
Right. Yeah.
So, hey, did God endorse that, pastor? I mean, I don't know, but I think even good men can get crossed up. Solomon started out well and then he got crossed up, man, if the heart is not dealt with and the person goes high in ministry, then a lot of other people can get broken in the process.
Yeah. If you could hop in a DeLorean, I got my DeLorean over here, my time machine, and go back to the beginning of all this. And there's one thing that you could have done different, and I know you didn't cause the abuse, right? And so that's not my intent in the question. But if there was one thing that you could have done different, either on that topic of boundaries or whatever, what would it have been back when all this was unfolding?
So I was always sort of drinking the Kool-Aid, if you will. And really what changed, so I told you 5 years, the last 5 years was much different and was bad. What changed is that I got married and my wife came in as she was an outsider. So she had a very objective viewpoint. She wasn't subjectively tied to the pastors the way I was. So she voiced some concerns immediately. And immediately when my pastor realized that my wife was seeing through the facade, he turned against her. And he was trying to stop her influence. But the way he did that was he brought me into his confidence against my wife. And I was a newly married man who really believed deep in my heart that honoring and doing whatever my pastor told me to do was that was honoring God. And so whatever he told me, even negatively about my wife, I would tell her as well. And so I was beating my wife verbally, like, you got to change, you got to get your heart right, like alongside of this abusive pastor. And like now looking back, I am, as a man, as a Christian, I'm embarrassed. I feel like I was like I hurt my wife. I did it under like complete, like just not knowing, but I'm embarrassed. I don't know how else to say it, bro. It's like, I was a horrible husband in that moment, and that I did not stand up to this man. And it's like I now see that like my marriage, that is the most important relationship, and nobody's allowed to come between that.
Yeah,
And I allowed that, my ignorance. And so I feel it, Vaughn. I can hear it in my voice, bro. But like, if I could change something, I would go back, and instead of siding with my pastor, I would definitely side with my wife and tell my pastor, like, you will never be allowed to speak about my wife like that to me. You can bash her with your friends, but you're not going to bash her to me.
Yeah. Man, that's good. Thank you for sharing that. I know I know that we can't change the past, but hearing those type of stories, man, and those examples are helpful for those who may find themselves in the middle of it, and trying to decide, okay, what do I do now? What do I do from this point on? And man, I just wanted to speak real quick to that before we wrap up. But that whole thing about the pastor, that thing that keeps resonating to me through this whole conversation is that pastor bringing that person into their confidence. And it's like we're spiritual leaders, and we pastor, but wonder how many therapists do you hear talking to their other clients about their clients, right? There should be a level of confidentiality that a pastor is required to keep. Somebody comes to me for pastoral counseling, that's between me and that person. But man, that sign, I never even thought about it that way, of that person having those side conversations and like, well, this is attorney-client privilege, if you will, it's just between us. But like, no, the pastor has to guard against that. And Aaron, before we wrap up, man, my encouragement to any spiritual leaders that may be watching, if you've heard some of these examples, that you're hearing this, like first and foremost, like, listen, I'm a sinful human as a leader and a pastor, and I need people in my life speaking to me to make sure that I'm guarding against becoming, one of these leaders that hurts people. And that's the hard conversation to have, right? To understand that all of us in the flesh, if we're not pursuing the Lord's ambition, we're susceptible to becoming these people that hurt. No pastor sets out to do that either, not to excuse the ones who are doing it. But for the spiritual leaders out there, man, like, you've got to guard yourself. We sometimes, the scripture talks about a man does what's right in his own eyes, but the Lord established the steps. And so many times we begin to make decisions that are, this is right in my eyes, this is the right thing to do. And then on the other end of that, there are people. Well, I appreciate it, man. Aaron, would you take a second? And I know some of this stuff wasn't easy to share, and I appreciate you opening up and sharing your heart, not just with us here, but with just, out there on the internet in general, man, dropping this stuff out there. And I know you're adding value when you go and you preach at different places, man. I can hear your heart for the Lord and your heart for Jesus and people and everything that you do, man. How can people find you and connect with you if they want to learn more?
Yeah, I hang out on YouTube mostly, and I'm on Instagram as well, but it's pretty simple. My name's Aaron, like spelled like the brother of Moses, J for James, like the brother of Jesus, and Daigle, like the brother of Lauren Daigle. Right. Unfortunately, I'm not a sibling to any of the three.
Right.
Aaron J. Daigle.
Nice.
My books are on Amazon. My videos are on YouTube, and I'm on Instagram sometimes.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can grab another one here. Also, Aaron's playlist on Church Hurt is here. And please don't forget to hit like and subscribe so that we can get these conversations and stories out to more people.